How's it going, everybody? Welcome to week 2 of Catholic Home Economics. This week, we're going to be speaking about the duty of love between the spouses and love in the family and how that looks in its practical application. Obviously, this is a really important topic to tackle right at the beginning of the course because love as performed, love as duty is going to be the basis for what pervades in this course and for all of the other practical applications of family life. They're all rooted in the duty of family love, spouse for spouse and parents for children. So it's logical that we handle it in this order. Part of this, like I said previously, the first couple weeks, some of the topics are more intellectual, but we do have a practical component for this week because manualists, because theologians, because moralists have broken down what that means to love, what love looks like when it's actuated in the family. They've spoken about this. They've spoken about what spouses should do for one another to show both dutiful love and affective love. So we'll be looking first at kind of the intellectual grounding for the duty to love, and then what that looks like in practice between spouses and then parents to children. All right, guys. So first, we're going to start with love of spouse. The love between the spouses is the foundation of the family unit. Love, like we talked about last week, especially in the family, is Trinitarian. The love between the lover, the active principle, the father, and the receptive principle, the son, spirates the Holy Spirit. When the son receives this love and reflects it back to the father, that gives rise to the Holy Spirit. And that is reflected in the family. The love between the parents obviously begets offspring. The father as the actor and the mother as the receiver. But in the sense, an active reception gives rise to obviously offspring in the family. So there's this Trinitarian aspect here that's at play that is going, that serves really as the basis for familial love. And John Paul II speaks about this in Familiaris Consortio, which his letter, essentially his papal letter on the family and on duties in the family. He says the only place in which this self-giving in its whole truth is made possible is marriage, the covenant of conjugal love, freely and consciously chosen, whereby man and woman accept the intimate community of life and love willed by God himself, which only in this light manifests its true meaning. There's this duty to love in marriage, and it is very Trinitarian. Whenever we see popes talking about like a community of life, and there's this analogy for the Trinity at play. So spousal love reflects Christ's love for his church. We know that it's revealed to us. Paul calls this a great mystery in Ephesians 5. But spousal love is not just, eros. It is a self-sacrificial love of service. All the other loves, whether it's eros or storge, these things all lead to the true love, the Christian love that matters, and that's agape love. So it's not that like eros itself, erotic love, passionate love between married partners or between people in courtship. It's not that that's somehow disordered. It's just incomplete. It's always ordered to something greater. It's not an end in and of itself. It's a means to achieving agape love, which is a love of service, a habitual attitude of service. And that's the charity that we speak of, that the Bible speaks of, that God commands us to have for one another. It's not love when you feel like it. It's love because the intellect dominates the will in properly ordered Christian life. And it's love because you ought to love, so you're forcing yourself to do acts of service and love even when you do not want to. That's the love that we're concerned with in marriage. Now, eros love sweetens that, and it makes it something that you want to pursue. It's kind of like the sugar that you add to medicine to make it go down. So this is a path forward towards agape, just like brotherly love, the love between friends. This is something that leads to an attitude of willing service among friends, because service is hard. But nevertheless, these things are means to an end. And that end, of course, is charity, which is rooted in ultimately love of God. So spousal love reflects Christ's love for his church, and there's this certain sense of kenosis, which is the outpouring of yourself. Obviously, when we refer to that in a theological context, we mean God's outpouring of himself, and almost like forsaking his divinity, like loosely speaking in a theological sense, to embrace the incarnation, to become man, and to give himself on the cross for us. That's what we're called to. Obviously, as people in the marital union, we're called to forsake what it is to just be flesh and blood creatures and really live for one another. Obviously, the animal instinct is to look after yourself as opposed to someone else. It's kind of foreign to the animal nature of this idea of dying for someone else. You want to preserve yourself. There's a strong instinct towards self-preservation. And obviously, this is why Christ is like, the greatest love a man can have for another is to lay down his life for him. And that's what spouses are called to do for one another, is to give to the point of almost laying down their lives for one another. Certainly, if there were ever a situation that called for that, but it's just total and complete self-giving. The Catechism of the Catholic Church speaks to this in some relevant passages. Looking at 1604, paragraph 1604, it always confused me in the Catechism why the little sections are called paragraphs instead of sections, because they're more than one paragraph. But I digress. But they're called paragraphs in the index. So, God, who created man out of love, also calls him to love the fundamental and innate vocation of every human being. For man is created in the image and likeness of God, who is himself love. So again, going back to this Trinitarian concept as really the foundation for family life. Since God created him man and woman, their mutual love becomes an image of the absolute and unfailing love with which God loves man. It is good, very good in the Creator's eyes. And this love which God blesses is intended to be fruitful and to be realized in the common work of watching over creation. And it goes on to quote scripture. Now, another relevant quote, another salient quote here actually comes from a classic that I think everybody needs to get on true femininity. This thing's been in like 20 different reprints, 20 different republications, and it was considered like the absolute classic on being a Christian woman for a long time. Like, this had a great run in the sun. Is Bernard O'Reilly's The Mirror of True Womanhood. It kind of gives the complete look at Christian femininity. And we're quoting that here. You were told that the matrimonial union had its model in the union of Christ with his church, that his great love for her, which brought him to the cross, is the type of the great and self-devoting love which the husband and wife should have for each other. And this is the case here. Obviously, we have to have this self-sacrificial love in marriage. Moving on. Now, marriage, we know, is both a sacrament of union and indissolubility. And these both are the natural consequences of having a self-sacrificial attitude. Total self-giving implies union. It also implies indissolubility. You can't give yourself and then retract, and you can't give only part of yourself if you're giving all of yourself. By definition, it's a contradiction. So unity and indissolubility are a product of total self-giving. If you only give part of yourself, your marriage is headed for the rocks. You're not gonna be able to make it, and that's the problem. Most people treat marriage as it's just like dating on steroids, where you've given part of yourself, and therefore you can kind of withdraw part of yourself. And that's not how it is. In marriage, the actual covenant itself, the idea of temporality, at least until death, is absolutely foreign to its essence. It's like almost a misdefinition. And this is why, Christ says it wasn't like this in the beginning. Whereas Moses allowed divorce, under the Christian framework, which restores what was given to us in Eden, in God's original plan for man and his helpmeet. It's the idea of divorce is foreign to that because it's not total self-giving. It's not this mystery that Paul talks about where Christ gives himself to his bride on the nuptial bed of the cross. Obviously giving his whole body, and this is why the Last Supper is integrally related with Calvary. He gives his body to his bride, the church, and then he hangs on the cross, the nuptial bed of the cross. That's what some of the patristics called it, naked in total self-giving to his bride. And that's very deep. This is what the concept we're seeing at play in Christian marriage. Christ gives himself all in all to the church, so we give each other all in all to one another. So the servile love of the spouses is only truly possible within the context of the indissoluble union of marriage. This complete service to one another only makes sense within this lifelong covenant. And here's the Catechism of the Catholic Church on the matter. It's worth quoting at length here. I hate long block quotes. Actually, when I was practicing law, the partners discouraged long block quotes because they say it gives a reader an excuse to just gloss over something. But you guys are all here, so I'm just going to read it. The love of the spouses requires of its very nature the unity and indissolubility of the spouses' community of persons, which embraces their entire life. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. They're called to grow continually in their communion through day-to-day fidelity to the marriage promise of total mutual self-giving. This human communion is confirmed, purified, and completed by communion in Jesus Christ, given through the sacrament of matrimony. Yada, yada. I think that's sufficient. So, spousal love is really important. This is kind of a bit of a nota bene here. It's not strictly essential, but this is a good quote because I don't think a lot of people recognize the centrality of spousal love to one another, to the entire household. In a lot of movies, you'll see like spouses kind of talking like, oh, we're going to stay together for the kids or something like that. And that kind of attitude doesn't work. It doesn't work in marriage precisely because spousal love is like the central feature and defining component of a happy household. So you have to maintain that. And here's a great book. I think it's Tan Publishers. Although I didn't put the entire citation fact up on the screen, but I believe this comes from Old Tan. And it's Charles Hugo Doyle, Sins of Parents. It's something, again, everybody should read. Some of these sources that we're pulling up for this class, I would recommend to everybody to read, acquire on their own. But he says, when a ship is in danger of sinking, everything is sacrificed to save it. Personal discomfort, loss of goods, hardships, all count for nothing so long as the ship is kept afloat. When the marriage of two people hangs in the balance, when love is sinking in a sea of doubt, every effort must be put forward to save it. Pride, selfishness, self-will, major and minor rights must be jettisoned to save the ship. Marital love is the most prized cargo on the ship of life. Everything must be done to save it. When love is let to die in the home, the sin may be visited upon innocent children for generations. And that's really true. Some of these sins have generational consequences. Your marriage, your family, since marriage is a sacrament of life, but it's a sacrament of physical life, and it's the first training grounds for children. If something goes haywire in your marriage, it trickles down to your children. They experience it. It's formative for them. And then they take that misadaptation, that misformation, and then they reflect it into the world. So this is why John Paul II says what happens to the family affects the whole world in which we live. And that's why we're seeing, as we pointed out in last week's lecture, that's why we're seeing the actual implosion of society before our very eyes. It's the wages of the attack on family and really the wages of feminism in general, which is an attack on the family. So what we do in our families is formative for the kids. And first of all, you have to form them in this familial love. And that goes back to parental love, which is the basis for the family itself.
Yeah, and people don't talk about it a lot where it's known that, marriage can be hard at times. And since in our vocation of marriage, we're called to perfection, our actions towards our spouse are not contingent on their actions towards us. And that's kind of a recognizing that your love and duty for God is the greatest love and duty that you have. So if you're called to the vocation of marriage, even through hard times, even through times where you feel like your spouse is letting you down, you still have to strive. No, no.
When your spouse really messes up and lets you down a lot, like, dang it.
No, you're a very good husband. But my point is just that you're striving for that perfection in your vocation. So if you're both doing that, obviously that's what makes a wonderful, great marriage. So if you're willing to not be selfish and you're putting your spouse first and you're really trying to serve them as God calls you, that's where you're going to make this progress in your marriage, where the love will really just become great. Because if you're both putting each other first and serving each other the way that you're called to truly in your vocation, it's really going to make a great difference.
And the moralists talk about this too. If you read any of the classic manuals of moral theology, they talk about spouses' duties towards one another are actually independent from one another. Obviously, they share a link in like your marital vows, taken as a whole, but you still have to be a good husband, even if your wife is not being a good wife, and a wife needs to be a good wife and fulfill her wifely duties, even if you're not being a good husband. So they're not contingent. And that's something you actually hear a lot, just like in a pastoral sense, when it comes to something like the headship of the husband, the duty of the wife to submit to his lawful authority. It's like, well, what if the husband's bad? It's like, well, the Catechism of Trent and the church in general specifies this. Obviously, it's all things but sin. So a duty of obedience is really important in all things but sin. If you have an evil husband telling you to do something like use contraception, you don't have to do it. But even if you have a bad husband who just like wants to take you on a trip to like some city that, he wants to go to that wouldn't behoove the family. He's just doing it for selfish reasons. He wants to go to like Atlantic City and, he's going to take you guys to someplace safe, but he's just doing it and he's going to like gamble and you don't want to do that. And you think the family would be better served by somewhere else. That's not like a sin to go there. So you still have that duty as a wife to be like, yeah, I'll go. Obviously, you should try and talk him out of it and talk sense into him. And that's what we were talking about, not being an overly passive helpmeet, because it's not really a helpmeet at all. But ultimately, there has to be a spirit of deference. And that goes for the husband, too. He has to do his duties, whether or not his wife is doing hers. Okay, so spousal love is manifest first and foremost through the faithful and selfless performance of the respective duties of each spouse. So duties are one way of showing spousal love. That's a main component in this idea of charity is duty. So these duties are rooted in the desire for the good of the other spouse. And this is something really important to say, like to preface duties with. They're necessary, but not sufficient. Everybody has seen the kind of popular image of the father who gets home, he's done his job at work, and he provides, he protects, but then he just zones out and he's not showing affective love to his kids. He gets home, he's distant. He's stern, he's cold, he gives commands, but they're not necessarily rooted in a place of love and there's no warmth behind them. So he's still like running his household, but it's distant and it's cold and it's sterile. That's not enough. And that's why the 60s followed the 50s. It's that exact notion of the cold, distant father who was like, my father never told me he loved me, but I know he did because he worked really hard. That's a terrible, terrible father. And that's not popular to say, because right now we have a glut of sentimentalism that's plaguing society. So people tend to overemphasize duties now on the right. Like conservatives tend to overemphasize love through being dutiful in as a backlash to just love through pure, raw, gross, saccharine sentimentalism. And it's wrong too. Like the fact is, a father needs to love his family, love them affectively, and he also needs to be dutiful. And again, this is why the 50s preceded the 60s directly. It's like, how could the bottom fall out so quickly? It's because the quote unquote greatest generation got back from World War II and were really materialistic. And you had fathers going to work and working hard, but then coming home and not like devoting themselves in full to the family life. And that bred resentment in kids who will fall away if they don't have this nucleus, this magnetized nucleus that pulls them to family life. They will drift away. They will rebel against the source of wounds that they have. So if there is a lot of talk from the family about education and morals and ethics and norms, and you do this, you get a job, you say please and thank you. If there's all that talk, but without the love that's at the core of the family that acts as its glue, that is what pushes people away. So a lot of people, like in parish ministry, and anyone who has been in parish ministry can like attest to this fact. A lot of people are like, well, my son's been, in a gay relationship for the last 15 years, and he's an avowed atheist. What like book should I give to him to get him to recant his, entire adult life, essentially, and all of his life choices? And the answer is like, well, there's no book. I'm sorry. No Scott Hahn book he's going to read through like a Scott Hahn book on the Eucharist and be like, by Jove, I was wrong. No, because the rebellion there is rooted in the will, not the intellect. There's no good intellectual decision to leave Christianity. Almost all rebellion against Christianity starts in the will. And the will is bad against the family precisely because there are wounds there. Like what you really need to do is create a time machine and go back like 20 years and see what went quite wrong in childhood that pushed this kid away, that made him averse to the idea of your model of family life, because he's rejecting your model of family life. He's not rejecting family life like because he's studied it and it just doesn't make sense. It does. It's universal human anthropology. The family is fundamental to society. Always has been, always will be, the nuclear family. So there's no good decision to do that. It's because there wasn't affective love. It's because there was an overemphasis on probably duty. So duty's necessary, but it's not sufficient. So spousal love must also be affective love. It must be expressed, not just through rote and mechanical performance of duty. It must simultaneously be a love that is felt, and not just felt, but actually articulated through word and deed for one's spouse. And ultimately, as you guys can probably tell, all these things are going to be directed at kids too. So there must be a genuine fondness, tenderness, and emotive love that is mutually shared. Again, it's not good enough for the father to be like, I show my love exclusively by doing my duties and by being a great provider. It's like, nope, you're not getting away with that. That's bad fatherhood. Yeah, true love is relational, like in the Trinity. There's no escaping it in that love of the Father for his word, the word being the thing understood. The love of God for the Son, the begotten word, is what, and that accepted love by the word that is reflected back to the Father. That's what really is the source of the Trinity, of Trinitarian life. So it's relational. And, again, in a theological context, using these words like affect is not precise, but in a sense, affective. Okay, so be dutiful. The duties of the husband are principally these. So we're going to go through what the duties of each of the respective spouses are. And, a couple sources, but this is the unbroken tradition of the church. So people who've been formed in really the feminist culture, in the modern culture will recoil at these things. It's just recoiling at the unbroken tradition of the church. If you look at basically any manual on marriage or any encyclical, well, basically any encyclical ever, but any manual on marriage up to like 1960 is just what you're going to get. It's in the patristics, it's in the scholastics, it's everywhere. There's no escaping it. These are what the church has settled on as duties of husband and wife. The duties of the husband are the government of the household and family, providing of food, clothing, and shelter. And then from the Catholic Marriage Manual, George Kelly, the successful husband must be the head of the family. He must be a source of inspiration to his wife, encouraging her to fulfill her duties as wife and mother. He too must be a teacher. He also requires insights into spiritual and emotional needs of his wife and children. He requires high resolutions and a strong sense of duty to meet those needs. That's a little bit, honestly, everything that for the husband goes back to his headship, because that's fundamentally who he is. He's the head in this relationship. And it almost sounds like word salad to parse out exactly what headship is, but there's a good reason for that. Husbands, men tend to be specialists. Women, because they are the governors of the home, are generalists, and their duties are broader and more diverse, whereas men's duties are really, they're fewer and more particularized, and almost a greater depth to what he must do to make up for their fewness. So, and you'll see this, guys like Chesterton talk about the wife as a generalist, whereas the husband is a specialist. And that's throughout many sources in Christian literature. But there are a lot of duties that the wife tends to, particularly because she is called to govern. The husband rules, the woman governs. So go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to add that as we were talking about last class as well, it's so important for a wife to be receptive and passive, because then if she's willing to be led by her husband, who has all of these, high aspirations for the family, she's able to actually be successful in what her duties really are. So that's important to point out.
Yeah. The duties of the wife arise principally from her position as man's helpmate. And that makes sense. God gives man a helpmate precisely to help him in life. And this goes back to scripture, that woman is the glory of man. So she is there to help him in his position as head of the family. She's there to help him with this vocation. Obviously, she's equal in dignity, but she is a helpmeet, and that is fundamental to her identity. So she must manage the household affairs with proper subordination to her husband. We know that from last class. She must be an inspiring companion to her husband. She must be a housekeeper who has skill in cooking, sewing, and cleaning. She must be something of an economist, able to handle her household budget and to shop efficiently for food, furnishings, and clothing. She must be proficient in feeding and physical care of her children. She must be a nurse. She must be a teacher with working knowledge of child psychology to discipline her youngsters properly. And as you can see, that seems intimidating. And that's why it's such a failure that we're not forming, especially our daughters, well, because these things, it's hard to cobble that together if you haven't been trained in it from youth. And Pius XII talked about this too, in some of his allocutions and speeches to like newlyweds and midwives. He talks about it's so important to train your daughters to love what is domestic, precisely because the duties are many, and what allure can the domestic life, which is so necessary, have for them if they're not shown the beauty of it and its importance from their youth. Okay, so affective love, and then we're going to go through. This is more the intellectual component of this class. We're going to go through and parse out some of those duties more in a second, in a minute. But right now, just getting the intellectual basis of these forms of love. Affective love must be expressed. We've said that already. It thrives, and this is from the Catholic Marriage Manual, on the demonstration of affection and dies from the lack of it. The failure to kiss in the morning and evening, failure to use courteous words, please and thank you in everyday relationships, the husband's failure to open the door for his wife when they enter a building, all of these lapses suggest that mates may be losing interest in each other. Gallantry and chivalry, as manifested by kind words and tender acts, are most desirable traits to cultivate. So it's not enough to feel love for your spouse. You actually have to show it too. I'm thinking of like Garfield Christmas here when the grandma is talking about her husband, like he was a stern man, and he never liked to show much what affection and excitement around the holidays and stuff. And then she goes on to lionize him, but like I knew he really loved me and he really loved Christmas and all that stuff. It just doesn't work like that. That's not like a real man. That's a damaged, partial man who probably suffered from a lack of love from his own parents. And we've, in a certain sense, and it's worth returning to this theme, have grown up lionizing this idea because we do live in a society that's been deluged by sentimentalist hogwash. Like that's the only thing that matters. But so we've rebelled against that, and then we've made it like that's almost something that is to be desired. The idea of a stoic father has come to mean a dutiful but cold father, and that's absolutely not what is going to create a good family. At that point, you are breeding children for the devil. I always say that liberals really like conscript kids. It's from good families. Conservative families have big families. Traditional Catholic families are big. And if you have all these kids and you don't train them right, all you're doing is breeding kids to become ultimately servants of what's diabolical. And the only medicine for that is to be a loving family where they're not pushed away from the family, but they're drawn closer to family life, and they see the image of the Trinity in your family, and they see the image of Christ and his bridegroom in your family. It's the only way. Otherwise, you are simply you're helping God to create souls, but then you're letting God down because you are creating these souls who ultimately will go on to service of the devil and the rejection of God. It's such an important thing. This should always be on parents' minds. It should always be on the front of your mind. Okay, so now we're getting into more practical matters. Husband shows his love by acting as spiritual and temporal head of the household. And so this is what Thomas Aquinas says about the spiritual headship of the husband in Summa. For good order would have been wanting in the human family if some were not governed by others. So by such a kind of subjection, woman is naturally subject to man, because in man the discretion of reason predominates, nor is inequality among men excluded by the state of innocence. So man, obviously, in governance means service. I forget what African bishop it was, but there's an African bishop that not so long ago said that a lot of people from this it's a society that's more third world, more primitive, they seek to get in these positions of power to use them for themselves, to like enrich themselves. And they don't understand like that when they took over and had self-governance, that what people were doing in these positions, the erstwhile actors in these positions, what they were doing was actually, serving others. They might have been somewhat corrupt, and some government officials are, a lot of them are, but ultimately they were doing their job still, and that job entailed service of others. And then when some of these, I forget what African nation it was, but when it had self-governance and these people from this third world society started taking over their own positions, they were just using them essentially to enrich themselves. So an African bishop or cardinal was like, no, you don't understand. It's by ruling, by having authority, it has to be used at the service of others. It's like the difference between Christ as the good king versus Satan, the tyrant. Heaven is ruled in a completely different sense than hell would be. and you want to be the benevolent king as husband and father, not the satanical tyrant. You look like you were going to say something. Were you?
No. Okay. That's a great example.
Yeah, thanks. Setting a culture of prayer, devotion, and attention to sacramental life, the bond of the souls. So husband needs to do this. He needs to use his authority to sanctify, to purify his family. So yeah, setting a culture of prayer, being the priest of the domestic church. So this is a role, and that role, that's what the headship should be ordered towards. He needs to be setting an example and setting a culture of prayer and piety in the household. A lot of guys don't want to do this. They think it's almost effeminate to be praying, and that's baggage from the culture in which we live, where a lot of men have fallen away. So now when they're looking for other examples of masculine piety, they're just few and far between. And a lot of the examples, unfortunately, of masculine piety nowadays are not very masculine. If you go to a Newmanless school, this is something I talk about a lot and decry a lot. You'll see a lot of guys who it's like, I can tell they have a big heart, but they just haven't been trained in what it means to be a man. So they're like overly thin and overly wimpy, and that's not attractive to men. That like puts them off and puts them farther away, and they don't want to be associated with that. So what makes them not want to do maybe where those like Newmanless school guys are really strong is in devotion life and in prayer life, and it makes them not want to do those things. But that's part and parcel of being a husband and father, is being priest of the household.
And what you'll find in family life is that time is so precious. So especially for men, when they are busy and they have a lot going on, it's hard for them maybe to take that time to set aside and do prayer with the family, or devotions or whatnot. And so having that encouragement from your wife is important, and also just being able to know that this is important for my family. Men need to know, like intellectually first, obviously that's how their minds work, especially is this is very important for my family, and then prioritize that time and set it aside for your family. Those can be hard things for men especially to do, because time is precious, especially with large families.
Sure. Something else that goes by the wayside, there's way too much dissent in families. The father especially is the source of identity for a family. Men need to strive to achieve a unity of thinking on spiritual and moral issues. That's part of headship, and it's part of his role as domestic priest. The priest is responsible for propagating the faith, not just for dispensing sacraments, but also for preaching the faith. That's one of his main duties. And a lot of households nowadays, there's a lot of dissent and fragmentation, and maybe some of the bad ideas have crept into the wife and children, and a husband as head needs to maintain doctrinal uniformity and orthodoxy. And that doesn't mean, obviously there's a great history of debate in the Catholic Church between like the Dominicans and Jesuits. It doesn't mean you can't have differences of opinion within things that are part and parcel of the deposit of faith, where you can be safely Catholic and hold both opinions. A husband and wife can perhaps disagree on some finer points of theology, or within a certain particular framework, even on politics. Whether the best way to combat, like, say, fentanyl or something like pouring over the borders. They might be able to disagree on things like that are trivial, but what they can't disagree on are things that are core principles, core tenets of the faith. You can't have, if your family, if your wife, if your children believe something that's doctrinally errant, or that's evil, or that's disordered, you as the head of the family really need to intervene and to kindly, lovingly disabuse them of certain errant traditions or errant notions. And that's something you don't see. You see overly demure fathers who are not, in fact, ruling their family. They're letting their family essentially go into a state of disarray because they will not intervene. It's not a good king. It's not a good ruler of a nation if he sees a problem in the nation and doesn't address the problem. But a lot of fathers are content to do that. They take a very laissez-faire attitude about their families. And then you get the seeds of these errant notions that are cultivated in wife and children, and they're never killed off like the weeds that they are. So that's his duty. And that this comes through this duty of headship and provision actually extends to this. You have to be a provider as husband, as father, in theology, philosophy, politics. It's you give to your family these things. You give them good sources on them. You enrich them. You catechize them on these things. That's partly what the dinner table is for. That's why Pope Francis said it's not a real family who watches TV at dinner. Like, you should be discussing all of these things at dinner. Theology, philosophy, politics. They all should be liberally discussed at the table, at communal times with the family. And then that's part of also educating your kids. You're not going to be able to do in 2 years of particularized study what you should have been doing over your entire lives at like mealtime. And those are civics lessons. Those are philosophy lessons. Those are theology lessons, tracking the news of the day and applying, what you know as father to those things, and having your family then learn from what you know. And of course, the mother has a role to form her intellect and to be an active participant, an active teacher in these things too. But ultimately, the father is going to be primary source of these things. So he needs to be righteous, virtuous, and well catechized himself.
And I would add that men should not be afraid to maybe get into some arguments with their wives. I think a lot of times men might be a little bit wary to discuss things or go into things in great detail when they feel like they have to correct their wives, or maybe their wife has some sort of bad idea and they don't want to, hurt her feelings or get into an argument. And it's for the good of your spouse or the good of your family to actually work things out completely. If there's a problem, especially something that is moral, obviously you have a duty to work it out until you have found the truth, and that you're both on the same page where you've discovered the truth together. And a lot of times, obviously that's why women sometimes they need men to come and share with them the intellectual kind of reasons for why something is the truth. Because sometimes women have a hard time putting those pieces together because we are emotional, and that's a good thing.
Well, that's what Aquinas says.
Yeah,
that's the Summa quote we have up there,
right?
Which is, yeah.
So it is. I feel like sometimes men can be afraid that they don't want to, make their wife upset or have this kind of discord feeling in the family. But know that sometimes that can be necessary for the good of your family, for the salvation of your wife, of your children. Same goes obviously with women. If your husband is doing something immoral or thinks something immoral, obviously you have the duty then to bring that up and to discuss it to completion, where you have figured out and you're on the same page. Okay, yeah, that is what is the truth, and so I need to conform my will to that, and that'll bring, obviously, it's kind of a joke that in the beginning of marriage there are a lot of arguments and stuff, because you're working those parts out of your lives where you disagree, or where you have some sort of thing that you need to work out so that you have harmony together in your marriage, and then ultimately in your family with your children. So that's really important.
Yeah, no, great point. Earning a living is the other component here, but everybody knows that. I don't want to harp on this too much. Men need to take their job seriously, have a good attitude about going to work, and strive to be the best at their profession. That's what a virtuous man does. He wants to be at the top of his respective profession, because there's always a pursuit of excellence, and that's really what virtue is pursuing excellence. So it's a product of a virtuous man, is that he will want to pursue excellence in his profession. What's really important, on the one note I want to make on this, is that your family needs to know that you are working for them. Your job isn't replacing them. It's not a rival to them. You're doing it as a means to an end of fulfilling your fatherly duties and earning a living. And it's in service of your family. It's not that you're choosing it over them, or you would rather be doing these things than you would be spending time with your family, your wife, your kids, and being affective and demonstrative with them. It's rather something that you're doing in service of them so that they can have the necessities of life provided. And think about this in the context of the two-income household, the unnecessary two-income household. What does it say when both spouses go out to work, or the wife leaves the home for quote unquote self-realization or empowerment? What does that say about the family? It says precisely, I don't need this, but I'm working for me. It's the opposite of the attitude that the actual breadwinner, the husband, should have. So it's doubly disordered. It's the opposite of the attitude that the real breadwinner has, is the attitude, well, I'm not the breadwinner. I want to do this thing and I'm going to do it unnecessarily for me. It's like, but the real breadwinner should be like, I'm doing this for you. So husbands need to not get bogged down in their career and let it overtake their true vocation. A career is not a vocation. It's a career. It's a means to an end. Okay. Husbands need to protect their households, period. Just like Christ in the church, it must be known that a father is going to lay down his life for his family should the need present itself. So husbands need to basically, I think there's a duty there to be in basic, decent shape. As a man, you can't just get married and let yourself go and be in a place where you're gonna have a heart attack if you ever have to run your family out of a fire, or have to, God forbid, fight off a home invader or something like that. And these are really romanticized, almost childish sounding ideas. But how about just from our life, 2 nights ago, our car, we got an exhaust leak into the car, and on the way to the store, which is, I think we had a big ice storm, and that we might have run over an ice block or something. And I think it severed the exhaust a little bit. So we started getting exhaust fumes into the car, which is not good because it's carbon monoxide, obviously. So we had to get the kids out of the car really quickly and up into a safe place, because we pulled the car off the road until we could take care of the issue. And so ultimately, you have to be able to pull your kids up to a safe spot. As a father, if you're a weak guy, you're not going to be able to do what you have to do to protect your family. And my only point with that is stuff comes up that you can't anticipate. So it's not always going to be the babyish, glamorized, I had to fight off an actual home invader, which does happen, by the way. When I was a kid, my house got broken into when my brothers were home, and they had to run out and call the cops. And so it's not something that just doesn't happen, that only happens on movies. But God forbid you're ever in that situation. You don't want to be, but you want to be able to take care of your family when there is an exigency. And that means being in decent shape and having a decent physique, and being in the upper quartile, probably in terms of strength, would be the floor for a good man at this point. Ultimately, I think all fathers need to own a gun. You really, in this day and age, I don't think you can say you're doing your duty as a protector without owning a gun. It's not enough to be the liberal guy in the movie that gets a baseball bat when somebody's breaking into his house. You've just brought a bat to a gunfight. There's no reason not to. If you're a responsible person, you will never have a gun accident. It will never happen. If you're taking care of safety, putting it away where it should be, cleaning it, pointing it in the proper direction when you do have to use it, in using all the safety rules that one needs to know about with guns, which are plenty. It could be a whole class on its own. But if you know that stuff, you're going to be at almost a 0% risk for anything bad happening with that. Okay. Husband needs to show affective and expressive love. He needs to initiate conversations with his wife about non-trivial things. We've talked about this a little bit in the terms of duty of providing information, providing conversation, providing intellectual stimuli. He needs to initiate contact with his wife, not just intimate, but also innocent, flirtation, affectionate contact. It's not just something that is all or nothing in the conjugal act. It's something that you need to be showing day in and day out. Little acts of affection, whether it's just like patting someone on the back or giving them a hug as you pass them in the house. It's really, really important. We are not just souls, we are bodies, and we need physical love. If you look at any of even like in the primate family, but if you look at like apes and monkeys, primates need to be effective love shown physically. There's always patting or handshaking, even in like the animal kingdom, when it comes to like the higher primates. So yeah, we need that sort of thing. You have to express verbally your love and your fondness for your wife. It's not enough just to show what's physical, because we're also souls. We're a composite of body and soul. So you have to show love through in more of an abstract sense, but you also need to show it in the physical sense. So you also need to express verbally your love and fondness for your wife. Express gratitude. Don't just take each other for granted in your respective roles. Say thank you to your wife for being a good domestic caretaker, for being a good mother, for doing her place, her vocation. Just as wives need to thank their husbands for being good providers and for being good husbands. Wife shows her love by being her husband's helpmate. The wife knows her husband most intimately. Therefore, she is to counsel him so that he becomes a better man and a better leader in his spiritual and moral life. And this counsel, I go on to say, don't be a bossy shrew. It's not overly passive, but it's not being a bossy shrew. And both are off-putting, and both we recoil at reflexively. And Aquinas makes an analogy here, or there's an analogy we can import from Aquinas. And he talks about when you're correcting your bishop as a layman, you can correct him, but not out of a sense of having authority over him. You can correct him out of just a love for what's true and good, but you have no authority to impose that correction on him. And that's a really good analogy for when a wife needs to correct her husband. Not only can she correct her husband, she should correct her husband when he's wrong, but she never does it from a position of authority where she can impose her will. She does it from a position of being a helpmeet, who ultimately, if her husband is going to be a cad, if he is going to be a heel, and he is going to reject truth and goodness and beauty and the wisdom of her counsels, she has no authority to overturn that. It's terrible. That's not right. And husbands have a duty to listen to truth and rationality, but there is no way to impose that on your husband. It's a fact of life. There are systems and structures and authorities, and when the authority, when who is head has rejected something, even if it's true, there's no going above and beyond that. Now, that never means assent to his error. You can't do that either. You don't obey in sin. But at the same time, you can't impose yourself. And that is, you do get the idea of the bossy shrew. And you'll see it on TV shows all the time. At the same time, I think a lot of traditionalist men want a wife that's overly passive and doesn't express herself. And that's not a helpmeet. That is a failure as a helpmeet if you are not expressing yourself. Wives are of equal dignity with their husbands, and they are moral agents just as well. So they have a duty to express themselves and to tell their husbands their counsels.
And if you're doing this properly and you're fulfilling your duties as a wife and are a loving wife, then your counsel will be seen as coming from a place of goodwill, and it won't be seen as just kind of trying to be bossy or trying to be overly corrective or something like that.
Yeah. The wife is in charge of running the household day to day. If they're feminine women, this is a great quote from Life magazine, by the way. So what, 1956 issue of like the Secular Life magazine, but it's worth bringing up here. If they're feminine women with truly feminine attitudes, they will, without self-conscious exhortations about the delights of domesticity, accept their wifely functions with good humor and pleasure. They will not think of themselves as just a housewife. And what this is saying is that running the household day to day is super important. Everything that women do as the heart of the home. Remember, if the man is the head of the home, the wife is the heart of the home. John Paul II teaches this, and it's absolutely true. A family without that wifely presence is a coronary. It's a heart attack. It's a dead body. You can't live without your heart. So what the wife does in the domestic life is so important. And there's this idea that behind every good woman or behind every good man is a good woman. And I used to, you hear that a lot from like politicians. So you think of it as like empty claptrap, but it's true. First of all, every good man was formed by his mother to do whatever his outward role is. And then second of all, the wife, the helpmeet, empowers man to do his external functions in society. It's not just a throwaway line. It's not just pandering to say that. What women do in the quietude of the domestic life redounds to the benefit or detriment of society. Behind every good man truly is a good woman, either as mother or wife. She coordinates with her husband to implement familial and domestic order. Husbands and wives need to talk a lot. They need to be on the same page. It astounds me sometimes how little involved husbands are with what's going on. Wives have this duty to go to their husbands, to plan their days together, to figure out what they need to do. And especially if you're homeschooling, which obviously we're going to get to later in this series, you're going to need to be in contact about forming a curriculum, about what you want your kids to learn, and you need to be strategizing about that. But about a lot of different things, there needs to be an open line of communication. We already talked about counseling him. And the duty to counsel, not nag. Yeah. Wife needs to endeavor to lighten the husband's burden in his duties. So if the husband has these outside duties, going back to this idea of wife as helpmeet, she has a role in making those outside burdens of the husband sweeter. So if he needs to go provide a living, then the wife provides for the husband providing a living. So she makes him a hearty breakfast, for example, precisely because she is helping him out in his duty as breadwinner. He's going to work. He needs to think straight. Eating well, eating right, eating healthy helps you think straight. So therefore, a woman is being a good helpmeet when she makes a hearty breakfast. The idea of having dinner, pipes, slippers ready for a tired and worn husband when he comes in from what he's had to face in the outside world for the day.
And husbands want to come home to a house that is clean and orderly and happy. And so, if you really are devoting your life to your vocation, your house should look clean, it should be happy. And those things really make a big difference for your husband and for your children.
Absolutely. Yeah. 100%. She needs to receive and magnify back the husband's affection. So she should be warm and demonstrative, especially in return, but also on her own initiative. She wants to receive and reciprocate her husband's affection. And she does this by caring about her personality, her grace, her appearance. And we have this good quote from early 20th century source here, basically counseling women, a book written by Emma Drake, What a Young Wife Ought to Know. And she says, a soiled ribbon and an untidy toilet may seem like trifling things, but they tell much of the esteem in which she holds her husband in her home. Not less, but more care is needed to retain the love and respect of the man of her choice than to win it. The pretty dress, the color of the ribbon, the manner of dressing the hair are not affected, but chosen deliberately because she knows they are pleasing to him. So wives, they need to put themselves, they need to make themselves essentially attractive to their husbands. That's a real thing. And they need to be receptive to his love, and they need to show that they want to receive that love. They want to receive that attention from him, particularly by paying attention to how they look and how they display themselves to him. And that's something, it's not really politically correct to say anymore, because we're told that we just have to not care about such things, or that it's somehow shallow. It's not. Obviously there's this body soul composite, and the exterior reflects what's interior. But it also just shows effort. If the husband has a duty to put effort in to being protector, the wife needs to put effort into being the beloved.
And also, it is not vanity to want to look nice for your husband. I think a lot of women think, well, if I care about how I look too much, then that becomes bad. You have to remember that it is why you are wanting to look nice. Why are you wanting to look good? If you're wanting to look good for your husband, that's not vanity at all. If you're wanting to look good for others, for just yourself, that's where vanity comes in. So it has to be properly ordered why you're wanting to look nice. And definitely it is proper to want to look nice for your husband.
Sure, you're inviting his affection. You as the receptive partner are inviting somebody's affection, and that's a good thing. It's like this active receptivity in a sense. Because a woman is to be domestic, one of the ways she shows her love is to make a comfortable home. And this is from the same source, what a young wife ought to know. Drake says, every young wife should be a good homemaker. An Eastern proverb says, the wife is the household. And the Japanese say, the house rests upon the mother. O woman, guard your treasures sacredly. This most priceless marriage gift, the title and blessing of homekeeper. You should make the home so attractive that no club can win the husband away from it in his leisure hours. You should make it not only a haven of rest for him, but a place for delightful entertainments of his friends at all suitable times. Okay, so love of the family. Families to be bonded together by love, which is expressed both through affect and duty. We've hit that ad nauseum at this point. It's here that the father of the family, the mother, children, and all members of the family exercise the priesthood of the baptized in a privileged way. This is the catechism. By the reception of the sacraments, prayer and thanksgiving, the witness of a holy life, and self-denial and active charity. The home is the first school of Christian life and a school for human enrichment. Here one learns endurance and the joy of work, fraternal love, generous, even repeated forgiveness, and above all, divine worship and prayer and the offering of one's life. That's how the love of the family is largely going to be expressed. It's going to be expressed in just warm human relationships, but also human duties. So love of children, I know we're up against the clock. We've gone kind of long today, so I'm trying to go through these a little faster. But love of children, love that parents have for their children, and you are called to love your children, of course. Harkening back to the theme of this lecture, love is the fundamental obligation of parents towards their children. All other duties are rooted in it. Parents' respect and affection are expressed by the care and attention they devote to upbringing their young children and providing for their physical and spiritual needs. As the children grow up, the same respect and devotion lead parents to educate them in the right use of their reason and freedom. So we're seeing something here. Parents have a duty to provide for their children and to educate their kids. That is one of the primary ways that parents show their love for their children, is dedicating themselves to their children in this service, this kind of outpouring of charitable love. And by doing that, that is one of the main ways parents will love their children. But that's not, as with husbands and wives, that's not sufficient. It's just one of the primary ways. Duties of parents towards their children: affective, demonstrative, and emotional love. Again, we've talked about that. Provision for life, health, and well-being. Education in the faith and in secular and practical things. So with affective, demonstrative, and emotional love, tell your kids you love them. It's important. They have to know that they're loved. And them knowing that they're loved is going to make possible their correction and their disciplining without breaking their spirit. Only the parents who lavish love on their kids are able to firmly correct them. So I see a lot of people not correcting their kids and kids running amok these days. You just go into society and you'll see it. And it's precisely because there's probably a defect in love. So therefore, the parents have a defect in being able to discipline their kids. But if you are doing your job as a father or as a mother, your kids are going to know so intuitively and so easily that you love them, that when you do have to be stern and disciplined, and you do have to be stern and disciplined, that it's not going to call fundamental things like your love for them into question. It just will never even be part of their mind. Okay, so give compliments. Speak positively to your kids when they do something well. A lot of parents, not so much anymore, but one thing you saw is overemphasis on negative reinforcement, where when they do something wrong, they are immediately and regularly punished for it. But when they do something right, everything is just fine and not a word is spoken. And that's not right. You have to be able to give compliments to each other. You have to be able to recognize your kids' good work. You have to be able to lavish praise. You have to be just as liberal with your praise as you are with your discipline.
And to make sure that when you are praising, you're not overdoing it. Don't praise things that aren't praiseworthy, just because you want them to feel good, because then they'll start to question, if you're praising them for everything, they'll start to question, well, do I really deserve this? Are you really proud of me? So make sure that you do mean your praises, but give them often, because they do mean a lot to your kids.
Yeah. And mothers and fathers are going to do this in their own way. There should be deference to the masculinity and femininity of each spouse. They're going to show their praise. They're going to show their affect in their unique ways. And there should be, obviously, respect for that. Families greet each other. A lot of families walk around. They just walk past each other in the morning. They're like living together. They're cohabiting, but they're not actually partaking in the family life. It's not good enough just to live with one another. You have to greet each other. You have to have meaningful conversations. You have to give each other hugs and examples of love throughout the day. Otherwise, you are just strangers living under one roof. If you have the luxury of having breakfast together, don't just space out and read a newspaper. Talk to your kids. Ask them what their plans are for a given day. Give them little bits of advice as they tell you what they're going to do on that day. All of these natural interactions. Catechesis does not take place at like some set time between 1 p.m. and 2 p.m. Catechesis takes place as needed and in a very organic way. Sure, you can supplement that with like a regular catechesis or a regular instruction on life. But most of the most valuable lessons you're going to learn from your parents come ad hoc and on an as necessary basis, or just through the organic development of a normal, regular, everyday conversation. We've already talked about this. Talk about substantive things. Don't just, this is to add on to what we were saying earlier. Talking about substantive things. Don't just do small talk. That's not a family either. When it's just like, hey, the weather today is nice. What do you think about that? I think it's nice. Well, what do you think about going to school today? Oh, that's nice. Like, you get into the weeds, talk about things at a deeper level so your kids can think at a deeper level. Be interested in who your kids are and what their personalities actually are. A lot of parents see their kids as an extension of them, and that's not right. These are individuated souls. These are their own people created in the image and likeness of God that have their own dignity. Do not just think of your kids as an extension of who you are. Get to know your kids. And again, this happens through talking. There's no getting to know people without talking with them, without having dialogue with them, without asking them questions. Yeah. Okay, and we go back to The Sins of Parents by Charles Hugo Doyle. From the beginning of his life, a child needs love, the secure love of both mother and father. It must itself experience that love. He means he. I don't know why he uses the, impersonal it for this, but he must experience that love, and he must see it demonstrated between father and mother. These are basic requisites. St. Thomas says that to love a person is to wish him well. And Doyle goes on, parenthood is an awful responsibility. It is no child's play. It demands faith, intelligence, preparation, study, emotional maturity, sacrifice, and an abiding love. Okay, so hitting this theme again, the father provides, the mother distributes, making the house into a home and making sure that each child gets what he needs. This is why it's so important to have the mother as nucleus of the home, because she, being in the home all day, has an eye on what each child needs, right? It's not just like if you're out of the house as you need to be to earn bread, it's not conducive to me knowing the individual needs of each child. It's only I can only know what my child needs corporately if I'm not intimately and intricately involved in what's happening in the day-to-day household. And that's precisely why you need at least one parent in the home. Right?
Yeah, it's super important. Mothers should be there around their kids basically 24/7. They need to know what their children's physical needs are. They need to know what their children's emotional needs are, intellectual needs. They have this broad responsibility of knowing precisely what each child needs for their formation, to be the best that it can be. And then she brings those needs to her husband, and they can talk about what would be the bsee things for their children, their individual children, because children are different and they do have different needs.
Well, and they struggle with different things at a different time, right? Mm-hmm. Like you'll sense something as the mother right. A lot of times that's going on that a kid might be struggling with, or they might need extra attention to at that point. And you really can only do that through presence, right?
Right.
It's not something.
Exactly. Yeah. That's why it's such a detriment to family life when the mother is out working, because it means that children are not getting the attention that is really necessary to form them to be good people. You can't develop a good conscience in a child if you're not perceptive to what's going on in that child's mind. And you can only do that if you're constantly around them.
That's right. Okay. So let's see. We've gone through some of this in regard to husband and wife, so I don't want to be redundant here. But each act of provision needs to be seen not just as an occasion of provision, but it should be sensed that it's an act of love. Kids need to know that I'm not just doing something for them because I have to or because I'm duty bound. They need to know that it's actually infused with a personal love. And you can tell the difference. It's the difference between getting care at a hospital from like a paid nurse versus care from your mom when you have an ailment. One is kind of distant and standoffish, whereas the other is, it's mercenary. Whereas the other, when your mother cares for you, you can tell she cares for you. You should have that sort of solicitude in each action that you do as a parent. That's what's ideal, is that your kids know that when you're doing your duties, you're not just doing them as an impersonal actor, going through some mechanical
checking off a list.
Right, exactly. You should be doing them as a loving parent, as a loving father, as a loving mother. So meals should not just be seen as ways to eat, but ways to have communion with one another. And mothers particularly show love by preparing a good meal. A meal is not just a meal. It's an occasion for gathering, and it's an event in and of itself. And what you see today, why there's so much like stir-fried chicken and plain rice and unsalted broccoli. You see that a lot today. It's because both parents might be working, and so meals are overly functional. And also there's an overemphasis on the absolute healthiest meal being served, because since mothers aren't showing their loves in other ways around the house, they're now funneling their care of their kids into serving them these almost autistically healthy meals. It's like an overemphasis on the health of something, where it's can I get some salt up in here? It's
a little bit of flavor.
Yeah. Meals should be more events, and they should take some time to make. It's not just the overly functional, bland, hunk of chicken stir fried up.
And if you know that your wife or your mother has spent time making a meal for you, it kind of, even if you don't think about the fact that she did that, you'll know kind of in the back of your mind that it mattered to her to make the meal good for you.
Right.
It mattered to her to make it pleasant and pleasing to you. So, and that goes a long way. If that's like an everyday occurrence that a mother is putting her care into meals for you, then when that child grows up, they'll look back and be like, oh, that was really thoughtful. That was really, that really made me feel like I was cared for.
Yeah, exactly. Because you can get by just doing your bare duty, which is like, I have given you your 3 squares a day. They didn't taste good. They weren't very fun, but I've done my duty and I've checked it off. But you'll see the extra 10% effort makes all the difference in the world. There's something, I've done 90% of my duty because I've served you a nutritious meal. But to make it like good and something to look forward to, that extra 10% is really what separates people in life. There's a strong, obviously just the law of averages. There's a strong tendency to do just what's enough. The extra 10% will make you like the standout parents that you need to be to keep your kids well grounded and in the faith, and to avoid really some of these wounds that will separate them from the family life in a society that's so hostile to goodness and virtue. Again, tucking your kids into bed, not just about getting them to sleep. It's about showing them love by singing them lullabies, reading them stories. All these things are infused with love and they will sense it. It's not just about getting your kids in bed, although it is about that. Again, you don't separate form and function. They should just kiss. There should be a nexus between them. So while it is about getting your kids to bed, it's about much more than that. Again, putting a Band-Aid on a wound isn't just about stopping an infection. It's also about showing a solicitude, a paternal or maternal solicitude for your kid, showing them that you don't like the fact that they have pain. In Sins of Parents, we have a quotation here. Dr. Eric Fromm expresses the idea thus: to love a person productively implies to care and feel responsible for his life, not only for his physical existence, but for the growth and development of all his human powers. It is the expression of intimacy between two human beings under the condition of the preservation of each other's integrity. The expression of intimacy. So to care for someone is not just caring for them, it's also expressing intimacy. It's what makes the difference between a hospital worker and a mother. You have to educate your kids in the faith. And we're going to go on about this. It's going to be its own segment. We're going to be talking homeschooling later on. So I don't want to harp on this too much. But parents, absolutely, as the Catechism teaches, have the first responsibility for the education of their children. They're the primary educators, as the church teaches. All other education from outside teachers is just supplementation. To continue the quote, they bear witness to this responsibility by creating a home where tenderness, forgiveness, respect, fidelity, and disinterested service are the rule. And just to break in here, that's exactly what we've been saying this entire time. It's not enough just to educate your kids on like the black letter law. You have to give them an education in what it means to be a family. And that really comes primarily from seeing, not just from hearing. It's something that you have to experience and take in from osmosis, or else all the book learning in the world will not suffice to make you a good family and to make you a good citizen and a good person and a fully formed adult. The home is well suited for education in virtues. It requires an apprenticeship in self-denial, sound judgment, and self-mastery, the preconditions for all true freedom. Parents should teach their children to subordinate the material and instinctual dimensions to an interior and spiritual ones. And parents have a grave responsibility to give good example to their children. So parents have this grave duty of educating their kids. The sacrament of matrimony, being a sacrament of life, is ordered towards begetting offspring. And it's not enough just to produce those. You have to teach them and form them for the kingdom of God. Otherwise, they will become part and parcel of the kingdom of the devil. You have to teach the faith, and this means both doing the spiritual life and practicing the faith and living by the precepts of the church, going to mass, going to confession at least once a year, but preferably like every couple of weeks. So you have to do that in actual practice, but you also need to teach intellectually the faith, as Vatican II actually taught. It's not enough just to live a good life and live a moral life. That's not enough to catechize people. You actually have to spread the gospel using words. And this was something that Second Vatican Council actually explicitly affirmed. So we hear this quote misattributed to St. Francis, which is like, preach the gospel, use words when necessary. And that's just wrong. He didn't actually even say it. And Vatican II is explicitly repudiated that idea. So not only do you have to live a good and pious and devoted life to God and live the sacramental life and live the precepts of the church, you also have to teach these things. You have to teach the kids and form them in their faith, and that means intellectually. At the same time, if you only form them intellectually, your words will be hollow and not ring true to them, and they will see it as almost hypocritical, and they will likely fall away. Then education. Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, kids do perceive, if you're just practicing something and they don't know why you're doing it, when they grow up, they're going to be like, well, this doesn't make sense intellectually. So why would I do this? Right. You have to lay that basis of, an intellectual understanding for them so that when things become hard, they know, okay, this is why I'm doing this. And this is why this is the correct path. And that's why I'm going to choose it, because it is good. It is right. It is just. So it's really important to make sure that you are getting the intellectual basis there, foundation there, but also obviously living it out as well.
Right. We're not just called to live according to conscience. We're called to live according to the well-formed conscience, and only that well-formed conscience is supreme. And of course, educating them in secular and practical things. And we're going to get into this more in the homeschooling thing, so I don't want to give too much away. But a lot of times you'll see, particularly people who have been well brought up in their faith, and they're basically practically and functionally impaired. They don't know they don't know basic facts about like biology and mathematics, although they can quote a catechism paragraph to you. And that does exist. I mean, for the most part, it's the other way around because society is so secular. But within some communities, you will see this where it's like the kids know their religion facts, but they don't know, just basic things that you should know that are part and parcel of an education. Education in secular things teaches kids how to think, because faith and reason are complements, not antonyms. Instruction in the secular things will teach the critical thinking skills that will allow your kids to have a deep and enduring faith. It's going to prepare your kids to have careers or to be able to teach their own kids. And that is part of what education does. It's not this skills-based education that the neo-Marxists are pushing, but that is certainly a component of education. A practical education teaching boys masculine skills and girls feminine skills is also going to prepare them for the future vocations and stations in life. That's basic stuff. We're going to get into that later, but that's all we've got for today. Do you have any closing thoughts?
I guess just to know that when you're going to embrace your vocation of marriage, that means to really desire perfection, because that's what we're called to. Now, it's super hard to meet that perfection and everybody falls short. But to know what that goal is, that's kind of the point, is to know what that goal is and then to strive your hardest to reach it.
Sure. Love is the key ingredient in the family. Otherwise, without love, you are a group of related people that are cohabiting, that are living together. Love is the tie that binds every component of family life together. It's what makes family life meaningful, and it's going to make it what gives a lasting impression to the very people that family life is called to foster and care for. So love between spouses is the foundation for all family love, but parents have this duty to show their love, and love in some is both dutiful and affective. So that's all we've got for today, guys. Thanks so much for being with us. We look forward to seeing you next week.